welcome back to Franklin Covey's twice weekly podcast on leadership with Scott Miller. That's me. I am your host each week on Tuesdays and Fridays, where we curate episodes both on audio and video with people that we think will make you more effective. Franklin Covey, of course, is the world's most trusted leadership development firm, co-founded by my hero and icon, Stephen Covey, who wrote the seminal book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And each week we have the privilege of interviewing people that are from all walks of life: CEOs, the C-suite, entrepreneurs, intrapreneurs, solopreneurs, actors, celebrities, scientists, creators, artists, Olympians. Sometimes it's people that may not be a household name, but they've survived something tragic or discovered something interesting, and summon the courage and the confidence to come and pour into each of you to make you better leaders, whether that's formal or informal. Today, we have the iconic journalist, anchor, author, and leader, glass ceiling breaker, Connie Chung. She has a new book out today called Connie, a memoir. Connie, of course, is a household name. You know that she was the first woman in history to co-anchor the CBS Evening News and the first Asian to co-anchor any news program in the U.S. And Connie has joined us today in a far-ranging conversation to talk about her life, her lessons. Connie Chung, welcome to On Leadership.
Thank you, Scott. It's a pleasure to be here.
Connie, it's our honor. As I mentioned to you, this is a podcast mainly aimed at making people more effective, right? Built on the heels of our founder's book, Stephen Covey, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. You have had an enormously effective life. You have broken ground for women, people of color, in all types of jobs. You've been an inspiration. You have a how many year marriage to your husband?
I think it's almost 40.
You think it's almost
and we
40.
got married late. You know, we were both old farts, and we got married, but we're still hanging in there.
Of course, married to Maury Povich, also a household name. Connie, I'm going to ask you to indulge me for a moment, because when I think of you, I think of seeing you on the television every night in the 80s in my house in Orlando, Florida. And you, of course, like everyone that has big success, has a long history prior to that. And I just wonder if you would take a couple of minutes and maybe rewind and remind our listeners and viewers around the things you did, your accomplishments, mostly, 2 steps forward, sometimes 1 step back, because you have a remarkable career as a journalist and a reporter that eventually landed you in the most iconic news seat, perhaps in our nation's history. Rewind a couple of decades and catch us up to speed with what happened when you became the first co-anchor, female, to host the CBS Evening News.
Well, the junior, the junior year, it must have been the summer of my junior year, I worked on Capitol Hill as just an intern for a congressman who was from New York. And he had me writing press releases and position papers. And when I looked around and I saw reporters doing their jobs on Capitol Hill, and I was meeting members of Congress, it was like seeing rock stars, actually meeting the people that I had read about, that I saw on television. I grew up in Washington, D.C., so I was very familiar with government and politics, because I grew up on the Washington Post. So I decided then and there that I would go into journalism. When I went back in the fall to college, a professor told me, try to get a job before you graduate, the semester before you graduate, and get your foot in the door. So that's what I did. I went around, I majored in journalism, which I don't necessarily recommend. I suggest majoring in history or geography or English. And I got a job at a local station. At that local station, I was just a newsroom secretary. That's all a woman could get back then. It was 1969, and women were trapped into traditional jobs. So, but I wanted to move up And it was right at a time when the women's movement was pushing hard for women and minorities to be hired. The news director said, I can make you a writer. I mean, I wanted him to hire me as a writer. And so I went across the street to the bank and I saw this very cute, energetic African American or Black teller. And I said, "You want to be a big star at the TV station across the street?" And she said, "Yeah." So I took her across the street. She became the newsroom secretary. I became a writer, and I kept pushing the news director to hire me as a reporter. And I got a position as a reporter. I was going into a restaurant to do a story on unsanitary conditions. It happened to be a very Tony French restaurant in Washington, D.C. And the CBS bureau chief of in Washington, his name was Bill Small, was having lunch there. I barged into the restaurant, demanded to speak to the owner, and tried to get an interview with him. The CBS News bureau chief was so impressed, he gave me his card. And when he got back to his office, 20 minutes later, I called and he hired me. So it was a whole series of aggressive behavior that got me into the news business because I knew I couldn't be a quiet little wallflower. What reporting was all about was getting up in front and being aggressive.
Connie, you've had an unbelievably tenacious, audacious, successful career. People can buy the book, Connie, a memoir, to learn that you pulled no punches. You talk about a lot of stories that are fascinating, hilarious, insightful, from geopolitical to, inappropriate things that happen or to you and other women in the environment. I'd love to pull you through to modern times and ask you kind of a current question, and then we'll take some steps back. What's your take currently on the state of the news media? How did it become so biased and polarized? Bring us to current time. Opine on the current state of media. What happened? How did it get to where we are? And where do you think it's going?
I bemoan what has happened to the news media today. And we're talking about every part of it, not just television. What happened, I believe, is back when the Vietnam War occurred, and I think there were people in this country who felt as if they were being lied to. So there was a wave of negativity, of lack of trust of the news media, of government, and our credibility as news people and the government's credibility began to dwindle. Now it's become a steady road down, and both government and media are at rock bottom. Our level of trust has been destroyed, much of our own doing. And I'm especially upset that the news media that I grew up in no longer exists. There's much too much opinion. It drives me crazy. I can't watch the news. And I have a hard time reading the news too, because I know that my friends who are still in the news business are doing a good job. And there are plenty of people in the media that are doing a good job, but there are a whole host of others who are perpetually expressing their opinion that I abhor. I absolutely abhor their audacity to say what they think on television. I can't get the truth. The pendulum has swung so badly, in my view, that I fear what our future holds in terms of what the news media can provide our viewers and our readers. But I have hope. My husband, with just a little bit of help from me, started a weekly newspaper, and it has won awards galore because it does news the old-fashioned way, with credibility and fairness and objectivity and telling all sides of the story. So I think if we do it a little by little and sort of recapture the trust of our viewers and our readers, we can get there.
Connie, what's the most important story you ever were responsible for reporting on or helping break or bring the facts as you saw them to light to allow the American people to make their own judgment on?
It was probably Watergate. Watergate was a seminal moment in our history. It was the biggest story of that decade. And there were so many stories that we were chasing during Watergate after Woodward and Bernstein, Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward broke them. So we were way behind the curve, but we did our best. And I think there were plenty of times when I felt like I was just, picking up hairs that they had dropped along the way. But I think it was so important, the reporting that was done during Watergate, because essentially our reporting, the Fourth Estate, the responsibility of the Fourth Estate was to expose corruption, and we found it thanks to Woodward and Bernstein, and took down a presidency. And fortunately, Capitol Hill was responsive to all the reporting, and because of their action, members of Congress telling President Nixon he could not survive impeachment or trial, he resigned.
Connie, what's been your most memorable interview? Either your favorite or your least favorite, but think about all the people you've interviewed in your career. Which one immediately comes to mind as the most memorable, and why?
I think, actually, it's not a particular interview that I did, but covering Nelson Rockefeller when he was Vice President of the United States. I was the first woman to cover a vice president, which is, I didn't think at the time it was a big deal, but apparently it was. And the reason why I enjoyed covering him was he was a politician who understood the relationship between reporters and a politician. To me, there were three types of politician. One who saw us as the enemy, as President Nixon did. Jerry Brown, Governor Jerry Brown, saw us as the enemy, and we have a former current president. I'll just quickly say, Donald Trump sees us as the enemy, but Nelson Rockefeller understood that we were just there to ask important and aggressive questions. Oh, there was another type of this number two type of politician was one who would try to manipulate us, and that was not unlike Henry Kissinger, who would try to make us believe that he'd give us the inside story by obscuring his identity. He would be the so-called high State Department official or a high national security official. And he'd tell us a story that was not attributable, but maybe was a trial balloon. And then the third type was Nelson Rockefeller, who I thought really appreciated and understood our relationship. If I asked him a tough question, he would answer with a tough answer. And I appreciated that.
Nelson Rockefeller, of course, vice president under the Ford administration after President Nixon resigned. In fact, you write a whole chapter about that. Who gave you your biggest break? You write a lot in the book about a sort of serendipitous meeting when you walked into CBS News, not knowing what was going to happen when you were named the co-anchor of the CBS Evening News with Dan Rather. Was it one of those gentlemen? Was it someone else? When you look back on your career, who was your biggest champion, your biggest sponsor, your biggest ally? Beyond your own hard work and tenacity and skills, who helped you get to where you are the most?
I think it was Bill Small, the gentleman that I saw at that restaurant back in 1971. He he really wanted to help the two women in his bureau, and they were Leslie Stahl and me. He wanted to push us. He wanted to put us in the trenches and show what we were worth. He pitted us against all the men in the bureau, of which we were very outnumbered, and he he rooted for us. He backed us up. He sent us to do stories that I think maybe we were less prepared for in many ways, but he knew we could handle it. He knew we could fight, learn enough on the job because he knew we were made of the right stuff. So he never, uh, he always believed in us. I mean, it was tough love, but both Leslie Stahl and I survived because he gave us the opportunity.
What do you think his motivation was? Why do you think he was so invested in your and Leslie's success? And I asked this question in the context of, if women are ever going to gain parity in income, in a seat at the table, at the board level, on the executive suite, it's going to have to come at the championship of men. It's never going to happen without men. Maybe you could answer the question as an inspiration to leaders who are men that can act more like Bill Small. What was Bill's reason for being so interested and invested in you and Leslie?
I think there were probably that, Scott, you know how a lot of people always say, well, that's such a good question, but it really is a good question. I'm not sure what motivated him. I think that one part of it was pressure from the women's movement and the minority movements to give women and minorities opportunities. But once we got in the door, once he hired us, I think he must have seen that we were so hungry and so determined to succeed. He had our backs. I know that he told one of the reporters when I was assigned to cover George McGovern's presidential campaign in 1972, and I was the third banana behind two men. He told one of the men to sort of coach me or be a role model for me, and to teach me things. And that particular reporter was so offended when I tried to bypass him and pitch stories to the CBS Evening News, because that was verboten. The the big reporter, I mean the main reporter, what I was supposed to genuflect to the main reporter and give him any story ideas. And when I didn't do that, and I went straight to the Walter Cronkite and his producers, he was greatly offended. I think when Bill Small heard about what I did, he just chuckled. He got a kick out of it because he said, yeah, she's aggressive. That's what I want. So I think I don't know. Bill, Bill had two daughters.
I'm guessing that's it. I wondered if he perhaps was seeing his daughters in you and Leslie and paving the path and testing the pressure.
Maybe. I mean, I know you have, is it 2 or 3 sons?
I have 3 sons.
3?
3 sons, yes, 10, 12, and
Yes.
14.
All right. Well, then I know I've heard you before in which you've said that you try to teach them sort of what a modern guy is should be. Is that right?
Well, at least I'm trying to raise with my wife 3 gentlemen in a not so gentlemanly world. That is an absolute focus of ours.
Well, that's good because I think today's young men kind of get it better. I grew up in a very traditional household, a Chinese household, in which my father basically subjugated my mother because in China, men are coveted and women are worthless. You kind of throw them in a bag, put some rocks in the bag, and throw it in the river. And my parents, just like the Chinese tradition, always wanted a boy. And they had 10 children, and when 5 of them died as infants because infant mortality was high back in the day. And they, uh, I think their tradition carried through. They never had, of the 3 babies who died, but 3 of them were boys. So my parents ended up with 5 girls. I was the last and the only one born in the United States. So I think in many ways I tried to become the boy my father and mother never had.
That is insightful. You share some riotous stories, one in particular about how in the CBS newsroom, they had just moved towards some robotic cameras and a very interesting thing happened. I'd love to have you kind of walk us through that because I found that one of many riotous stories in the book.
I was anchoring the news at NBC. It was a Saturday because I did the Saturday news, and the robotic cameras were set up to save money so that actually camera people would not have to work. And the 2 big robotic cameras, actually there were 3, was on me while I was talking about the Middle East. And then all of a sudden it started to move. And I could see it moving. And I thought, well, I'll go with it. And I kept going with it and kept going with it. But I knew that I was on a platform. And I was really afraid that I would, drop it out of sight. Like,
Or your chair,
it would
your
have been
rolling
more
chair would
dramatic.
fall
It would
off
have been
the basis,
whoop,
right? Yeah.
Like through a trap door. And just at the moment, just before I was off camera, in other words, I was getting perilously close. It was like this. The camera went and it came to a halt. And I went, thank God. Oh my God. I'm so glad it stopped. The entire control room was laughing hysterically.
Connie, you write about and you've talked about, you worked quite closely sometimes with Walter Cronkite. Of course, I think to most of our viewers, he is more of a name than he is an experience. Right? I think Walter Cronkite was probably in my early years watching the news. What was that like to work with someone that we now think as sort of the standard of journalism, ethics? Was your experience similar to that? Did you have a different experience? What was it like with Walter Cronkite?
He was perfect. He was a great newsman. He was like Santa Claus. He was friendly, humble, just self-effacing. He was never like the anchormen that I ended up working with, who were full of themselves and you couldn't fit their heads in Madison Square Garden. Not Walter Cronkite. He was actually a very nice man, and he treated all of us who were his worker bee reporters, so respectfully. I never felt that he was condescending or treated me as if I were less than. He would whenever I'd see him, I mean, he was just so classic. He was, hello, Connie, how are you? And anytime when I became the co-anchor of the CBS Evening News, he called me and said, gave me a lot of advice, but the one I really will never forget is that he said, my best advice is to be yourself. And that's what Walter was. He was himself. He didn't pretend to be someone else, as I believe some people in television news do. Excuse me.
Well,
They try to put on a persona that is not accurate. I think they are not real. And I think Walter was always real. And so I took his advice. I was myself.
Connie, to that point, you have less charitable comments about your co-anchor at the time, Dan Rather. You have a fairly complicated relationship with him, I'm guess. You talk about your experience from your point of view very openly about that. Anything you would elaborate on? It's actually a fascinating couple of chapters in the book about how you were named as the co-anchor and what that was like. And of course, he went on to manage his brand in a fairly, I'd say, controversial manner, whether it was the storming off the set after the US Open delay or the taxi cab incident or other things. What would you say to those that are listening today that might read your book about what you learned at the time about your relationship with your co-anchor Dan Rather that might be helpful for someone dealing with a similar situation?
Well, I'm hoping that today men are co-anchors are a little less, how can I put this, territorial. It was not easy asking him. I mean, he was being asked to move over a few inches to make room for me. He had his own. He was anchoring the CBS Evening News by himself for a long time, and I think he did not take kindly to being told that he had to share the desk. He had to share Walter Cronkite's chair with someone else. I don't think he would have been very happy had been anybody else either. I mean, a man, a woman, a dog, a plant. It's just not something that he would have taken kindly to. So it probably wasn't personal against me that he didn't want me there. But, you know, I think it's a little hard to recreate this kind of scenario for someone else. That was a different time, a different era. It was the 1990s. I'm hoping that today things have changed and that a man is less, finds sharing the chair less repulsive to him. The whole paradigm, news has changed so much anyway. It's difficult for two people to share a half-hour program because there's not that much to do. And it was probably difficult back then even to have somebody share with another person for just a half an hour. I think that my experience was not a pleasant one. I did run into him years later on a train on the Acela, and he kind of said, "No hard feelings." And I thought, I wonder if people saw us sitting there and wonder how come we're going somewhere together. And I thought, well, if anybody asks me, I'll just tell them we're going to an old people's home for washed up anchors.
Connie, look back on your career and what have you done well that maybe is timeless and is applicable to anyone's career now, regardless of what's changed, regardless of the industry? What's a practice or a principle or a philosophy, a mindset, a skill set that you can say unabashedly, I did this well, and this can serve anyone well if they apply it right in their own career?
It's it's not unlike, and I saw in one of your podcasts, you had in the back Bob Iger's book, the head of Disney.
Yes, of course.
And one of the things he said, which just struck me, was that it's basically, I mean, I can't remember the exact words, but he wanted, he encouraged leaders to be civilized and to listen, to be kind, to be real. And I think there was another CEO who I had noted that he said his key to the success of his corporation was to listen to your employees. So I think in my business, I always treated everyone, no matter what they did in the newsroom, what their jobs were, with equal respect. And I knew a lot of people in my business who did not, who were so self-absorbed that they couldn't bring themselves to think about anybody else. I know I left a legacy with people with whom I worked, that that I was a nice person. And I think the viewers kind of know that too, because I don't think television lies. If you see someone on the news every night, you know who they are, you know who the phonies are, you know who the real people are. And over time, people know who you are. So I think there's a different lesson for women and minorities. We have kind of a hard time getting automatic respect. I think, unfortunately, I think men, including my husband, gets respect from the get-go. He's not considered a second-class citizen, whereas women often are, and I think minorities often are. I wear my race on my face, and people do not think of me in any other way except, oh, Chinese. And I'm proud to be Chinese. So women, I always say women can take a page from the male playbook. And that is that we can walk into a room and try to command it, because I think men do that. Men have bravado, and I think they when they say things at a meeting, they believe they're right. Women, I believe it was Madeleine Albright, the first woman Secretary of State, said that she very often had been in meetings with the National Security Council, and she failed to speak up. And then a man spoke up and said exactly what she was going to say. And she went, why didn't I say that? I think women have a tendency to fear that what they're going to say is going to be stupid. I urge women not to believe that, to go ahead and say it, to speak up. I also think that women are big team players. We tend to praise all the people on the team and never take credit for ourselves. I think that's one thing that we have to kind of get over. And I urge women to do that, to go ahead and say, boy, I was important for that story to get done. Had I not investigated it, along with X, Y, and Z, it never would have happened. So I'm hoping that women of future generations will be bold and take risks and believe in themselves and believe they can do it.
Connie, I'd like to compliment your answer, compliment with an I, but also an E. because you've disclosed something that you do very well in your answer. We have interviewed 400 of the most iconic, influential leaders in the world on this podcast, people of significant fame and stature and wealth and influence. And in 400 interviews in 6 years, I can count 3 people that ever had prepped for this interview, that had ever watched a previous interview, that knew anything about me, that knew that I had 3 sons. So you obviously, to your core, you come prepared. Even for a podcast like mine that is not the CBS Evening News, the podcast that I host for Franklin Covey, it is clearly inculcated in who you are that you come prepared.
Well, thank you, Scott. I mean, I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. I think it's rude not to know about the person who's interviewing you. I think it's disrespectful. And once I watched several of your podcasts, I love your enthusiasm. I mean, you're so curious and you're into it. And I thought to myself, gee, I hope I was like that, that I was as engaged and as engaging as you are. Because you have done your homework. So I was obligated in my mind to always do my homework. And, and once I got into you, I admired you, and it was great.
Who would have
And I
thought
like
that?
your set,
who
you
would-
know?
who would
You
have
have
thought-
another set. It's a
Who would have
little
thought-
different.
Who would have thought Connie Chung and Scott Miller would have become besties? I appreciate I'm going to pay you one last compliment, and then I know our time is ending. Not only were you prepared for today, but you treated this podcast as if it was like any interview you would have done, I'm sure, with the launch of your book, Connie, a memoir. You will do lots of more substantial interviews than that of Franklin Covey's podcast, but you have treated this as you would treat any podcast.
No. You don't you say that. I think this was important. And I think you've had some great people on. Well, anyway, go ahead.
Well, I have, and I appreciate, Connie, your book. I feel like I was with you in your life because you wrote it in such a easy, breezy, fast-paced style. I don't think you belabored any of the points. If anyone is interested in your career, your history, you are an iconic part of American history. You had a courtside seat, metaphorically, to some of the most impactful events in our country's history. Your book is on sale now, available in hardcover copies. Connie, a memoir. Connie Chung, you are a class act. Thank you for investing in us for what's been 45 minutes, way over the time that your team agreed today. I appreciate you, and I highly recommend your book.
Scott, can I tell you one more thing?
Please.
It was so hard to write this book because I was writing what my editor called just the facts, because I said, but that's what I do, And she said, no, you have to tell how you feel. And I thought, oh, no, I can't do that because that's against the rules. That's verboten in news. And she said, you must. So it was like pulling teeth, Scott. I really, it was excruciating because she kept trying to extract how I felt.
Well, that's what a great editor does, right? Is to help make sure that your story is as interesting to you as it is to me too. Connie Chung, again, I'm grateful for your time today. Thank you for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you, Scott.
And we'll see you back here next week for a new conversation on leadership.